treacle tarts, thank you so much for joining me for this video. It means a lot that you are joining me for it. It means a lot to me that you are agreeing to go on a journey of reflection with me, a journey of reflection that I have been on for quite a good few months now. I've actually had the notes for this video sort of collecting together for, shamefully, I would say around the 5-month mark. I think I started the notes when I was in the UK, and I've been in Amsterdam now since 28th of February, and it's now the 28th of May. So I've really had these notes sort of percolating. Is it percolating in English? I don't know. I'm a Twin Peaks person, so it's percolating to me. Yeah, I've had them basically brewing, marinating, all of that for quite some time, and I'm finally sitting down to put these thoughts and feelings into a video. I'm going to be talking from the perspective of a white witch and a white spiritual person. I'm going to be talking to people who are white or white passing, who are witches or spiritual people who feel like this information is relevant to them and helpful to them. I am not by any means saying that non-white people can't watch this. I fully would love it if non-white people would watch this. I would love it if Black and POC people, other POC people would watch this. I would love your comments, your critiques, your feedback. But I want to make it clear that I'm not speaking to you. This is really something where I'm directing my contemplations, my questions, and my challenges towards white witches and white spiritual peeps. I never want to overstep my mark when it comes to offering advice where my advice is essentially meaningless or my experience of something is negligible or meager. I never want to put myself into a position of any kind of leadership or hold anybody's ear when I know that there are community leaders already doing a sterling job who have far more understanding of things than I do. And so I'm talking from the perspective of where I can come from, which is I'm a white witch, I'm a white spiritual person, and these things have been laying heavy on my heart. I've been thinking a lot about them. So please don't feel like this is not a video for you to watch. It is totally a video for you to watch if you are not white. It's just that I'm talking from my perspective towards people who may very much share that perspective. And it is about white fragility. It is about racism and white supremacy and how we tackle that and how we view that as spiritual people, as witches, as practitioners in any way. So you can see what I mean, how it's not actually directed towards non-white viewers, but I would love it if you would take the time to watch if you feel called to. Lots of things contributed to me finally deciding to get my notes in order and make this video, but I would say that the slayings of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and much more recently, of course, George Floyd, those are the three big ones that have really brought me back to my sense of responsibility to raise my voice on this and to reflect on the wider issues of systemic racism and white supremacy and how that relates to the way that we see ourselves as spiritual people and the way that we talk or do not talk about these things that are happening and the kind of role that we play or do not play, and why would it be that we don't play a role, and if we do play a role, what is it, kind of thing. I think that those are the recent tragedies that have occurred that have really weighed on my mind, and you know, really frankly, after watching what I can only describe as the despicable murder of George Floyd, and by all means I couldn't even get to the end of the 2-minute clip, let alone the entire thing, although of course I have read about what happened. You know, after that I felt moved to speak about this and put it out there. It's not going to have any theatrics in it. I'm not going to cry. It's not going to be anything like that. I want to talk about how we can be purposeful and about how we can direct our intention if indeed we are bothered by this, if it is something that we feel like we need to begin to address and maybe we haven't been addressing it as we feel like we could or as we feel like we should. The comments for this video are going to be approval only, and that is to make sure that the space is kept completely safe for people of colour who are going to be in the comments and wanting to interact, wanting to read, wanting to say something. There's definitely going to be room in the comments for debate, but there is definitely not going to be room in the comments for racism. And so, you know, I have to kind of personally sift through everything and make sure that it's fit for purpose. A lot of the time when the word spiritual is used to describe somebody, What it means is that they are compassionate, they are kind, they care about the planet. It usually also means that they have some kind of practice that connects them with the sense that what is important is not just them, but what is beyond them and how everything connects together. I usually feel like when someone's being described as spiritual, that is what is being said about them. Now, if somebody describes themselves as spiritual, it doesn't always mean that. Sometimes it can just mean that they have a very, very dedicated spiritual practice, and they might feel like it doesn't have to do with anything really aside from them, or aside from the relationship between themselves and the deity or the essence or whatever that they work with. But I think a lot of the time when people describe themselves as spiritual, they are also saying that that is what they mean, that they are kind, that they are compassionate, that they are conscious of the bigger picture, that they don't just make their decisions based on ego or based on self. They believe in the oneness of everything, and they believe in equality. Because of that belief in the oneness of everything, then that would obviously extend into a strong belief in equality, a strong belief that all people are equal. So even though the term spiritual is used so often to describe someone, or for someone to describe themselves as being interested in equality, having the belief that all people are equal, that kind of thing, and even with the fact that a lot of white spiritual people have, strong, consistent spiritual practices and what seems to be a strong conviction in their beliefs, it's interesting how many of us find it difficult, find it tricky, find it deeply, deeply unpleasant to tackle acts of racism, or to talk about and tackle the system of white supremacy. Sometimes I think it can be even more tricky for quote unquote spiritual white people, right, to talk about these things than it is for those who wouldn't deem themselves spiritual. And I want to get into why a little bit in this video. In this video, I'm going to be talking about how I feel that my spiritual path should be something that I see as a strengthening instrument that helps me to deal with things that are going on in consensus reality that need my attention and that are calling for my focus and my action. But at the same time, I do recognize how I could see my spirituality as a place to run away to, a haven, a little sort of place where I can lock the door and not engage with what is going on in consensus reality that I find to be bothersome or disturbing, or that I really feel obviously needs to change, and that I need to be a part of that change as a white person. I do think that when it comes to the definition that we place onto racism and the way that we understand it, there is obviously a large percentage of white people and a hefty percentage therefore of spiritual white people who think of racism as a collection of unrelated and unfortunate acts that are certainly racist, but do not really connect with each other, or are not a symbol of a larger problem in some way. So I think a lot of people view racism as racist acts which are individually perpetrated or perpetrated by a group, but they are not tied to anything. They are not the result of anything. They're not part of a pervading system that also threads its way through everything else. But I have the belief, and I know that a lot of other white people in my audience have the belief as well, that racism is also occurring when we are silent about those acts that take place. Racism is occurring when we are sort of burying our heads or turning away, or just pretending really 24/7 all the time that this thing doesn't involve us. It's not, we're not needed in the bigger conversation about how to stop these racist things that happen. So I believe that not speaking up about racist acts that you witness and that you identify as racist is also racism. I believe that silence is complicity. I believe that white silence is violence, because I believe that there's a system of white supremacy. White supremacy is the belief that obviously white people are superior. Whiteness is next to goodness. Whiteness has the most credibility. Whiteness has the most beauty. Whiteness has the most influence and should have the most influence because it's the most trusted. All of that. I believe that white supremacy exists, and I believe that white supremacy is threaded through the entire machine. And what I mean by that is that I believe that you can find white supremacy in institutions, in politics, in media, in representations of people of colour, in the way that they're talked about on the news. I believe that you can find white supremacy around the dinner table. I believe you can find it in the workplace. You can obviously find it in legislation, right? So to me, white supremacy is a thread that goes around the entire machine of society, and I'm a cog in that machine, you're a cog in that machine. When you know that there is that poisonous thread of white supremacy that has gotten connected into the whole machine, then when you are a happy little cog in that machine and you keep working to maintain that machine without making a noise, without malfunctioning, then you're propping up that machine. The more that the machine is supported, the more that the cogs just turn and everything is seamless and everything just goes along and runs that way, the more fatal the machine is. Because when a white person that is perpetrating an act of racism feels very confidently that they're not going to be called out, they're not really going to face massive consequences, they're not really going to experience a feeling of being ostracized by what they see as their community, the white community, and they feel very much supported in the thing that they are doing. They've seen it done before, they've seen it talked about lots of times, they've seen it advocated by their family, by people around them, their friends, their work colleagues, their president. Then it's much easier for them to do it. It's much easier to feel like it's obviously a thing that they can and should be doing. Obviously, although white supremacy is, inherent in the society that's been built, the way that we dismantle it is through making sure that we don't create hotbeds where people feel like what they're doing is not deplorable and is not going to have consequence to it, or they're going to be considered a hero for it. They've never really faced pushback about their beliefs, so why would they face pushback for their actions, If we are silent, if we don't speak up, if we don't step in, if we don't make our white voices heard, then white people who want to perpetrate racist acts are going to feel very assured and very comfortable in doing so. By the way, I do know that there are a lot of white activists who watch my channel. I do know that there are a lot of people who are doing really good anti-racism work in their communities, with their online platforms and that kind of thing. They're starting those uncomfortable conversations, and a lot of them are uncomfortable. But I do know that for my part, I have not been doing my work. I have been doing probably about 10% of the work I know I could be doing and the work I know I would like to be doing. I don't stay focused on it personally. And so I know I must be talking to a lot of people who feel similarly. I know that every time these kinds of things come around that we see in the news that are just heinous, like the murder of George Floyd and so on, I know that there is definitely a feeling that I get of crickets in the spiritual community and the witchy community. There just is, okay? I'm just going to be honest about it. Now, when you have a channel and it's based around a theme or a Twitter handle or a business, or you're a sort of spiritual speaker, whatever it might be, right? No, not every post can be about the last, shocking thing that just happened in the news. Obviously, otherwise your business would be pulled ridiculously off track, or your creative endeavors, or your witchy group that you have on Facebook, or whatever it might be. So no, you cannot talk 24/7 about every single thing that's happening in the news. But I'm saying that there is notably a big sort of gap where there should be perhaps any talk about political change whatsoever. Maybe I'm not just talking about racially motivated crimes here, and the trauma that is felt by the Black community and the POC community. Maybe I'm talking about anything. Maybe I'm talking about anything political that is an issue, anything that is going on in wider society that is a problem. I feel like I see a lack of discussion around much of it. Not saying I don't see any discussion about it, but I see a lack of discussion about it on social media, on YouTube, on social media, in groups, anywhere. And I want to call myself out as being a part of that problem, for definite. I have definitely, talked about things on my social media and on YouTube, but it has been, I feel negligible in terms of what I could be doing. And this is also about my life as well. It's not just about my experience as a YouTuber, my experience as a spiritual business owner. It's also about the way that I am running things in my life in terms of what am I reading? You know, what am I learning about? Am I filling in some of those gaps about things that I don't understand? And I want to come to that a little bit later in the video as well. For most white people that want to get involved in anti-racism work, it is very hard to attend your first anti-racist protest. It's very hard for a lot of people to share an anti-racist petition that they just signed on their social media if they've never shared anything like that before, if they are sharing it in front of friends, family, people with different opinions, maybe some people with very strong opinions. That's going to be a scary thing to do. It's going to feel like a lot of exposure. It's going to feel like something that might put you out of your depth, or something that you don't really know what kinds of reactions you're going to get. So that can be scary. It's hard to start a conversation with family members, with friends, with your partner, with one person in particular, about an issue relating to racism or white supremacy, either if it's just what you're seeing on the news that's disturbing and upsetting you, or whether it's specifically something racist that you have heard a friend or a family member, for example, saying, or something racist that you've seen them doing. It's hard to start that conversation, even though you might feel moved to, and you might feel like you really should do, and it's what you need to do. I think a lot of people also don't do anti-racist work because they are fearful of being corrected by a person of colour, or by someone who is just very much more experienced with anti-racist activism. And, you know, sometimes it can be uncomfortable to just be trying to do your best to address something and to be corrected. So, sometimes white fragility comes in, and I'm going to talk about the definition of white fragility in just a moment, but sometimes that kicks in and you feel like you might rather avoid that kicking in rather than experiencing it kicking in. Another thing that I think might affect spiritual white people in particular is the fact that it's depressing to think about racism. It really lowers your vibe to see what goes on, to think about what goes on. It's upsetting, it's frustrating. It can really harsh your mellow, man. Even just the idea that someone can be treated differently because of their skin color can be sometimes, like, it can feel intolerable for a white spiritual person to think about. But if you really connect that truth with the truth of what spiritual is supposed to mean, it doesn't add up, does it? It doesn't add up that one would be so quick to protect themselves and their mind and their emotions and their space by completely ignoring something that is brutal and systemic and damaging and traumatic and not directly experienced by that spiritual person. You know, there's something about it that doesn't click, but it does go on a lot in the spiritual realm and with spiritual people, is this belief that they do need to protect themselves from that low, anything low vibe, anything that could be damaging or toxic or harmful. Sometimes it's hard to know if your efforts are really going to be of value, and you might feel like you want to know they're going to be of value before you actually take pains to make those efforts. You might worry about friends or family members who have been displaying racist attitudes or engaging in racist behaviors, saying racist things, and they may never have heard you before actively speaking out against racism or talking about white supremacy, and it might put them on edge. It might, put them on the back foot with you. So you have to acknowledge that there might be a certain amount of change if you have been allowing things to slide with certain relationships in your life. I think another thing that comes along for spiritual white people as well is that they just do not want anyone to feel judged, and they do not want to come across as though they are judging anyone. A lot of spiritual people want to be compassionate and work from a place of love and work from the energy of love. But unfortunately, white spiritual people can have a tendency to tell themselves that the way that they do that is to ignore a person's racist behavior, sort of pretend that they haven't seen it, in order to avoid that person feeling judged for it. Despite all of those things that might be scary about starting to do anti-racist work or doing more anti-racist work, there are so many white spiritual people also who claim that they have a very power-packed spiritual practice, myself included. I feel like my spiritual practice is so hardcore game-changing. A lot of us work with very powerful deities. A lot of us work with war deities, and deities of death and destruction and all that stuff, that big juicy stuff. A lot of us recite ancient mantras. A lot of us go on group silence meditations. A lot of us observe the turning of the wheel of the year, which has incredible themes and is very grounding and anchoring and strengthening. We use all kinds of different tools, and we do spellcraft, a lot of us, and all of this stuff, right? So really, if you think about it, those things that we do in our power-packed, high vibration spiritual practices should be and can be directly linked to how prepared we are and how strong we feel when we do our anti-racist work that we feel like we really want to do and that we need to do and that we should show up for. Unfortunately, I think spiritual fragility is definitely a thing. There are definitely a lot of narratives that are woven in the spiritual community around helplessness, the need to protect oneself, that kind of stuff, incapability. There's just this vibe that comes into a lot of the conversations that is about making sure that we are protected. Many white spiritual people are empaths, so they are very much engaged in discussions around how to create boundaries around themselves so that they don't pick up on other people's emotional trauma and other people's emotional complexity. And of course, that is an important discussion to be had if you have empathic abilities. But I think too often that's where the discussion stops. It's about finding those things that help you to get your protection, to get your strength, to feel better. And that's where it ends. There's not really the ongoing part of the conversation that we could attach to it, which is around what are we doing that for? Now that we are feeling stronger, now that we've found our modes of protection, what can we do with that energy that we have now, that capability that we have now? That could definitely be a discussion that we could stand to have a lot more. And look, I'm starting with myself. I'm not saying that I've been sitting around putting out these resources about how we do anti-racist work or how we battle collective shadows. Those are definitely things that I've swerved. Those are definitely topics that I've largely avoided. It's something that I'm focusing on and I'm meditating on, which is exactly why this video is being made. I'm not trying to speak to white spiritual people from above. I'm trying to say I'm in this boat, I'm on this train, and I've been thinking about it. Another element of spiritual fragility that I personally see a lot is the dialogue around not being able to take on any news, not being able to keep abreast of world events because it's too traumatic. It really throws you off kilter. It lowers your vibration too much, that kind of thing. I definitely feel like it's important to have breaks, and sometimes extended breaks, away from news of world events or events in your community, away from understanding of social injustice. But is it spiritual to remain locked into that attitude that is what you need for all of time? That's what you need for the rest of your life? Is that the best use of the spiritual work that you're doing? I'm not convinced for my part. I've never been convinced for my part that is the way I want to go with being a spiritual person in this reality. And like I said, I understand extended breaks are sometimes needed. But again, is there that other part of the conversation that we can be having a lot more about how do we come back to a sense of feeling empowered enough to know what is going on with social injustice around the world or even in our own town or city? How do we come back to the sense of what kind of difference we can make or what kind of conversation we can have or how we can broach this in our red tent or in our coven or in our online Facebook spiritual group or on our platform or within our business model? Obviously, the majority of resources that I make are revolving around the healing of the self and the empowerment of the self, bringing love back to self and really just sort of forging a sovereign path, an individual path. For me, self-love, shadow work, those things that I talk about are absolutely so important for the betterment of myself as an individual. And also by extension, they're important when I look at the way that I treat the people in my life and when I look at the way that I respond to the situations in my life. But I don't want to stop there. I want to keep having an ongoing conversation with myself, that other bit of the conversation that now needs to be sort of clicked on a lot more regularly for me. And that conversation is around how I can go from the personal to the collective when it comes to my shadow work and my self-love. If I'm doing this work and if it's helping me to strengthen and if it's helping me to power up, then I would like to feel that I'm utilizing it for more than just whatever is going on in my personal life that I want to take on or that I want to be better with, you know? I am personally going to start checking out for myself how much my spiritual work is helping me to face whatever worries I have about anti-racism work or about any other work that I might do of that kind of ilk. I have always known that I am not just a witch for the sake of it. I am not just a witch for caprice. This is not a game. This is to power up and level up across the board. And if part of that means anti-racism work, which strongly calls to me, and which I feel like I do want to be more engaged in my personal life and on my platform as well, then I want to know that my practice is feeding that calling. I want to know that any concerns I have around it, any fear, any ego stuff, any shadow stuff is being tackled by my spiritual path. Otherwise, what's the point? Otherwise, what is the point? Am I just doing this for kicks? I'd like to think not. I'd like to think that I'm doing this so that I can go forth and create the changes I need to make, deal with my shit. And if a part of that is focusing on what is going on more broadly around me and what is going on that does not directly affect me, i.e. what is going on that is not just self-oriented, then that's wonderful. I want to make sure that my practice is set up to prepare me and to arm me and to fuel me through what I want to do with battling the collective shadow and recognizing my responsibility to see where I have been feeding the collective shadow, and also potentially making resources where I take you guys on this journey with me and we talk together about how we can do better and how we can focus more on the collective shadow as well as the personal stuff. As a sincere shadow chaser and as somebody that does believe that I can see a lot of the collective shadows, I can understand the collective shadows and how they carry themselves out and what they look like. I think for me personally, it would be a crime against my own self and my own psyche to get to the end of my life and know that I only used my shadow work and my self-love and my spiritual practice to address the personal, not to address the collective or my place within the collective. I think that would be a crying fucking shame. And that's why I'm putting this out, because I want to talk to anybody who feels similarly and wants to start doing the work more diligently and not letting spiritual fragility get in the way. I'm definitely not saying that we shouldn't be drawing strong boundaries around ourselves to protect ourselves from things that are damaging to us. But I'm saying that we need to question whereabouts are we drawing those boundaries sometimes. I don't want to be so spiritual that I am hypersensitive and I have to go away from the world and I can't be involved. I want to be, by contrast, so spiritual that I'm both feet in. That's how I want to be. And like I said, no, not every single one of my resources or every single one of the books I read in my spare time or every single one of the podcasts I read or every conversation that I have is now going to be about anti-racism or about white supremacy. But I know that I could be doing a lot more. I could be saying a lot more. I could be learning a lot more. And I think that it's a testament to oneself as a shadow chaser to really understand that. So if you also feel like you are a shadow worker, you are a shadow chaser, you are invested in the concept of shadow and you're invested in exploring your shadow, and you are a white person watching this, I would also ask you to really start to get a handle on whereabouts you might be using your status as a spiritual person to run away from collective shadow work, which you would actually like to engage with more. Shadow work should help me to recognize my privilege, and it has. I have done shadow work around white supremacy and around other things as well that have helped me really keenly connect with my privilege and with the ways that I have been unable to see it and recognize it, and really coming to an understanding about that. And it's been difficult work sometimes for me to do on myself. But I feel like I've really gone there and I have done that work. I want to continue to do that work, but now I really want it to materialize in the actions I'm taking as well, and the way that I'm spending my time, the things I'm learning, and the things I'm saying on my platform more as well. I have decided that it is not enough anymore to say that my spirituality and my journey of self-development have made me into a better friend, a better partner, a better card slinger, you know. I also want to be able to say, and genuinely mean it, that work that I've been doing has made me into a better member of society, and it's made me into an activist, and it's made me into someone who is not willing to turn away just because something is not directly oriented around me and who I am and what I go through. I know that there are so many white spiritual people, myself included, who have experienced trauma, who deal with mental health issues, who deal with all kinds of issues that might make it impossible for them to start regularly going to anti-racist rallies or start regularly really investing themselves in, you know, studying the history of Black feminism, or, you know, having conversations that are considered to be that are maybe high risk for you, whatever it might be. I know that everybody has their various limitations. So what I would ask you to think about is, what work can you do? What would set a healthy challenge for you in terms of work that you can do with the collective and with the collective shadow? Obviously set your limitations, know your boundaries. But I'm personally going to be asking myself, what are the healthy challenges that I can set for myself now? And I'm going to talk to you at the end of this video about what I'm going to be doing and the commitments that I want to be making. A lot of the characteristics of what I see as spiritual fragility overlap with white fragility. Now, I'm not saying that non-white people can't experience spiritual fragility. I think some of them are, you know, locked into patterns of spiritual fragility. Obviously, it can happen to anyone. It's not a race-based thing, right? But white fragility is race-based. It is something that is experienced by white people. White fragility is exhibited when a white person walks away from a conversation about racial injustice because they feel uncomfortable with it, or they want to sort of police the tone of a conversation about race so that they feel more comfortable within it, or they want to censor certain pieces of content in a conversation around racial injustice, again because they want to feel comfortable and they are centering themselves and what feels better for them. White fragility can very much come up when somebody is called out for a racist opinion that they hold, or for a racist action that they took that they may not have seen in that moment to have been racist, but it doesn't mean it wasn't. The way that they might kick back or act defensively, even when they're being called in with love by maybe a close family member or a partner, that can be white fragility. I think that spiritual fragility and white fragility can definitely overlap, because if you think about the excuses that you make when you're in the midst of an attack of spiritual fragility, it's going to be things like, oh, this is bringing me down, it's lowering my vibration, it's not good for my energy, you know, it's just, I'm so sensitive from the spiritual work that I do that I can't be involved in this, I can't really focus on it, turn it off, I don't want to talk about it, right? I think that those things can actually be a clever disguise for what you're really saying, which is more in the white fragility side of things, which is like, this is making me feel uncomfortable. I don't feel safe in this conversation because I'm not being centered in this conversation. It's not about me. It's about how I need to empathize with others. I feel guilt around this conversation. I feel angry. I'm not sure whether or not I'm going to say something wrong, so I want to just exit stage left, maybe in an angry way. That's actually white fragility. So I think that a lot of the time, the excuses that are available to us in this spiritual fragility sphere can be like a Venn diagram with the white fragility sphere, where we don't really want to admit that what we're experiencing is white fragility, right? We're uncomfortable as white people with discussions about race and racial inequality. So it's easy to sort of pop a spiritual excuse on it and just be like, oh, you know, I can't even watch about that. I can't even talk about that. I can't even, you know, it's just, I'm too spiritual. I'm too damn high vibe. I'm too damn high frequency, whatever it might be. I actually think a lot of that is just a cover up for plain old white fragility, which really, if you do shadow work, you should be able to sometimes identify in yourself. You should be able to identify it when it comes up, lock into it, see it for what it is. Obviously, you don't come straight into shadow work on day one and start identifying your white fragility if you've never identified it before. But I do think that it's where we should be headed. It's what our aim should be, to be able to see those things when they come up. How many times have you in your life used a spirituality get out of jail free card to avoid a conversation, to avoid dealing with something that needs to be dealt with? That's something that I'm thinking about for myself. It's something that I have been reflecting on in the last few days, and it's been very useful for me. So as I mentioned before, I'm thinking about what would be some healthy challenges for me. How can I expand in a way that, yes, it feels challenging, but it's not impossible? What are actually my limitations, my time limitations, my emotional limitations? It's okay to have some. Everybody has to have some, right? So I'm thinking about that as well, and I'm thinking about how I can self-care after I've taken the challenges that I want to take to push me forward with anti-racism work. But I'm also thinking, how many times have I used the fact that I'm spiritual in order to get out of addressing something or get out of being a part of the change that I want to see in the world? And I would welcome you to ask yourself that same question. I want to quote an excerpt now from an article by Corrine Fletcher. White Silence is Violence and How to Be a White Accomplice is the name of the article, and I will link it down below. There will be lots and lots of links, guys, down below. So it says here, we have to acknowledge openly that white supremacy exists and white privilege exists. We all need to be able to recognise both to do anything about them. And unless we are actively using our white privilege to dismantle white supremacy, we are complicit in its preservation. This is also my belief. White people need to use their white privilege to talk to others about it. If you're uncomfortable, that's good. Comfort sustains white supremacy because it makes people who benefit from it complacent in the status quo. That is so important. Invisibility gives white supremacy power. Call it out. Use white privilege to interrupt white supremacy, to dismantle white supremacy, to take a back seat and support others who have been oppressed by white supremacy, to give those who have been oppressed by white supremacy opportunities that they've been denied, and to learn from those who have been oppressed by white supremacy, and use your privilege to listen. I think even long-time anti-racist activists will tell you that they do feel uncomfortable or fearful sometimes. And I think they would tell you that that is part of the work of fighting alongside people who feel uncomfortable or fearful most of the fucking time. That just is straightforwardly what it is. Don't forget that when you are open on social media about your anti-racist stance, when you're open in your friendship group about your anti-racist stance, when you do not let something racist slide at work, when you are open online about your anti-racist stance, if you have a platform, if you have a business, right? In any of those ways, when you do that, you are not just letting white people know that you are not going to just sit by and be culpable and be part of whatever it is they're doing, but you are also letting people of color know that you are not going to be doing that. And that is very valuable. That is very valuable. The work that white people have to do is not to tell people of colour how to deal with their healing over this or any of that stuff. The white folk work, hashtag white folk work, good hashtag, guys, when that work that we have to do is about talking to each other. It's about engaging with other white people about things that need to change in our behaviour and in our attitudes. And that's very important to mention. We need to use our privilege, use our white privilege to make differences that people of colour might not have the access to make or might not have the influence to be able to make because of racism. When something comes out of my white mouth, very often it will have a very different effect than when it comes out of the mouth of the black woman next to me, right? So I need to be aware of that in various spaces. I need to be aware of that when interacting with the police, for instance. And I've fortunately, because of the way I was raised and everything, I have been long aware of that. But the nuances of it, I've often picked them up over time, working in offices, engaging in discussions online. You know, watching people of colour being demeaned for opinions that I've then gone ahead and espoused and been praised for, right? And also just watching myself find it easier to get an audience for my work, or to have people listening to what I'm saying, even though it might not sometimes be as brilliant or as relevant as something that, again, the black woman next to me on YouTube or in the street or wherever is saying, right? So over time, I've picked up this understanding that I have privilege, that is something that can be used. It's not just a sad fact of life. Oh, what a bummer! I'm unfortunately benefiting from this system that favours me above non-white people. No, it can be a tool. It can be a tool that you use to dismantle this gross machine and be part of starting something different. Let me just go a little bit more into the use of white privilege, just to really sort of like drive the point home and make it clearer, okay? So I want to read 3 potent descriptions of white privilege from the essay White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Napsack by Peggy McIntosh, which is a big deal. You know, it's something that I've many times seen linked underneath people's videos about this kind of thing when I've been learning and engaging. So here are 3 descriptions of white privilege that explain what it means to have influence and to have power that can be used. You can sit on it, you can just ignore the fact that you have it for the rest of your life if you want to, and never use it as an instrument of change. But if you want to, then you have to, of course, recognize how does that privilege operate? How do I see it in my life? And here are 3 ways that you can see it that I think are particularly potent when it comes to taking action. So the first one says, I can go home from most meetings of organisations I belong to feeling somewhat tied in rather than isolated, out of place, outnumbered, unheard, held at a distance, or feared. The next one says, I can be pretty sure that if I argue for the promotion of a person of another race or a programme centering on race, this is not likely to cost me heavily within my present setting, even if my colleagues disagree with me. And the other point says, if I declare that there is a racial issue at hand, or that there is not a racial issue at hand, my race will lend me more credibility for either position than a person of colour will have. Those are powerful points, powerful things that white people have at their disposal that we are obligated to use. These 3 realities of white privilege are so power-packed, guys, and I want to read through something that I wrote about them. The first point reminds us that we are largely comfortable in many spaces where people of colour are not made to feel included and comfortable. We therefore have the ability to stand up against racism and actively pursue inclusion and fairness within those spaces that people of colour often cannot access. And what will help us to do this? Definitely our spiritual tools, our spiritual practice is one of the things that will prepare us in readiness for this thing that we see that we want to do more of. The second point reminds us of what heavy cost actually means. I put off making this video for months because I felt like the notes were arduous. I couldn't figure out quite what I wanted to say. I knew I would have to deal with some backlash and anger to some extent, like being accused of virtue signaling, people being defensive, some people unsubbing, etc. It happened after my Black Lives Matter video, so you know, I know that I'm in for some of that. I knew that I might get something wrong and be told as much in the comments and feel bad about it, or have to deal with the kickback of my white fragility. But is any of that actually heavy cost? Is any of it heavy cost at all compared to the heavy cost that is being experienced now by African Americans, for instance? It's not really, it's negligible in comparison. A handful of people unsubbing, me putting myself in the hot seat for a while, just simply having the courage of my convictions on a public platform, it's not much compared to what the African American community are experiencing. The third point reminds us that whiteness is often tantamount to influence. White supremacy places whiteness on a par with goodness, intelligence, credibility, the right to speak. No, people will not automatically agree with you every single time, but you have far more chance of cutting through someone's inherently white supremacist mentality than a non-white person, obviously. So why not utilize that privilege more of the time? And again, how do we do these things? How do we possibly prepare? How do we possibly toughen up enough to feel like we can do these things in various ways, in various settings, whatever's relevant for you? I argue spirituality. I believe in my spiritual tools. I know that they charge me up for the day. I know that they empower me. And so I know that spirituality, the fact that I'm spiritual, is not something that should limit me. It is something that should actually light a fire under my arse, and it is something that will fuel the work that I want to do and the actions that I want to take. I don't want to think of being spiritual as being aligned with being endlessly weak with no end in sight. I want to think of being spiritual as something that makes me more inclined and more capable of doing things like anti-racism work. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to make some commitments to myself, and I want to publicly talk about these commitments because I want accountability on these commitments, and I want to have a record of what I said, a public record of what I said, right? Anyone who wants to follow along with me with any of these commitments that I'm making, please do so. Or if you feel like there are other commitments that you need to be making, please leave them down below. Make yourself publicly accountable. Be seen, be heard. Talk about what it is you're going to change or do more of. I'm going to read more on the topics of white privilege, white silence, white fragility, and the collective shadow around these things. I'm going to read articles, I'm going to read books. My reading list in general has already been going in that direction. In fact, I'm currently reading the Collins book of Black Feminist Thought. It is amazing. Patricia Hill Collins. Oh my goddess, yes, this is incredible. But there's a lot more on my reading list that I've had on my reading list that I'm going to bring to the top of the reading list, and I'm going to leave my reading list below in case anybody wants to follow along with any of the work I'm doing around reading about Black feminism, equality for people of colour, any of that jazz, right? So that's one thing I'm going to be doing. I'm going to think more about the collective shadow in general and how marginalised identities intersect. I'm going to make content around deconditioning for those who grew up with racial prejudice, and I'm also going to make a piece of content for those who want to be in their power more as activists. I've already done that once before, and I will leave that down below, but I'm going to talk about it more as the months go on. I want to make a concerted effort not to just talk about my own insights or things I picked up online that could be useful, because that's meager, you know. I want to bring in people who can seriously speak to these issues if possible, and I'm going to be really making an attempt to do that. I'm going to think about what my anti-racist role is as someone with a voice in this world, and in my case, as someone with a voice with an online platform. I'm going to share content more from Black and non-white writers, artists, etc. on social media, and I'm going to elevate their voices more. I'm going to be more vocal about my anti-racist stance where it counts, not only online, but out there in life as well. I'm going to pay attention to Black spiritual thought leaders, writers, and cultural commentators who are talking about white allyship, about what the Black community needs from me as someone who wants to be an ally. And I'm going to be passing that information on and remembering that it is never the job of a non-white person to coach me on this. It's my job to go out there and tap into the resources. That's what I'm going to be doing. I'm not going to be asking anyone to break it down for me. There are people out there breaking it down for white people who want to understand how they can be better and do better. And I'm going to be tapping into those resources, and I'm going to be keeping a note of those resources. I'm going to start shadow work journaling, and I'm going to be using the specific daily challenge formatted by Layla Saad, and I will leave it below. There is a specific way that Layla, who is incredible, by the way, if you don't know about Layla Saad, get on it like a carb on it. She's incredible, and I can't wait to read her book. I'm so excited. It's on the reading list. But Layla has a specific suggestion for how you can go about shadow work journaling when it comes to matters of your white privilege and breaking that down. So I'm going to be using that format. I'll leave a link below to that, a description of that format. So if you want to follow along, you can do. I'm going to push for change nationally and internationally, particularly though, keeping a finger on the pulse more with what's going on in my country, where we have our own race issues and we have our own history of racism. I personally vow to be more active in campaigning for the Windrush generation. That is a situation that's very close to my heart, that has bothered me a lot, and I've lost a lot of sleep over it. I'm going to leave some information below for people to read about the plight of the Windrush generation here in the UK if you don't know anything about it and you want to learn something about it. I'm going to make at least one monthly donation to a POC creator. I'm going to consciously make an effort to do that. I will give people the opportunity to specifically share their favourite POC speakers, writers and video makers on my social media. That's something that I'm really going to be doing. I'm going to be letting people share Instagram handles of non-white creators. I'm going to be asking on Facebook, who do we need to know about? Tell us, spread the good news. In the comments section below, I'm going to leave these things pinned there. So if you want to have a look through again at the commitments that I'm making as a white spiritual person, as a white witch, then please do go through and have a look at those commitments. In the comments, please let me know if you have any commitments that you are going to bring into your life relating to this issue. Let me know. If you have thoughts, if you have feedback, if you have critiques for me, please also leave them below. Thank you so much for being a part of this journey in this video, thinking about these things. I know that they can be difficult sometimes, but it's also absolutely vital, and I don't think in all good conscience that I can talk about being the shadow worker that I see myself as being and that I think I am without addressing things like this. And so yeah, thank you for coming along with me, and I look forward to reading the comments. So much love, baby cakes, and blessed be.